Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever in the world you are right now. We're delighted you are joining us for this incredibly important session to discuss the intersection of finance and the swathe of rules and initiatives that are being unveiled right now to embrace sustainability and environmental challenges. Now, in the last few weeks, I've been listening to a series of panels about all the measures that policymakers are doing to try and get ahead of climate change. And it's very clear that COVID-19 has not slowed down this initiative thus far. I say that because just over a year ago, the Financial Times launched a special platform to look at environmental, social and governance issues called Moral Money. If you haven't seen it, this is the platform. And I thought earlier this year when COVID happened that we might actually be launching at the wrong time. And in fact, it turns out that interest has been increasing, not decreasing this year in a way that's very striking. But everyone agrees this can't happen without private sector finance being on board and getting involved in every aspect. There's a huge opportunity, but there's also a huge need to bring finance on board. So we have two fantastically good panelists today to talk about from their perspective what needs to be done to get private finance properly engaged with all these Sustainable Development Goal initiatives, the European Union's green initiatives, etc., etc. Sadly, very sadly, we don't have Thomas Verhey with us. He's the principal advisor to the Green Finance and Investment for the European Commission, but has had to drop out because of a family emergency. But we have two very important bankers. Daniel Hanna, who's global head of sustainable finance at Standard Chartered, who has a great perspective from Europe on what the European Union is doing and what London is doing, but also how that impacts on emerging markets around the world, which is an incredibly important question. And we also have Candida Bracha, who is Chief Executive Officer of Itaú Unibanco, who can also give us an on-the-ground perspective of what this means, not just in Latin America, but right around the world as these developments continue. So let me start perhaps with you, Daniel. Since we don't have, sadly, the European Commission representative here, we've had a lot of discussion from the European Commission and from the European Central Bank about making finance green. I was hearing earlier today, in fact, about some of the extremely bold pledges and the breakneck speed that the European Commission is trying to go at, or frankly, breakneck for the European Commission anyway. How does this look to you as somebody who's trying to square this with a global bank that's trying to support emerging market capital flows around the world?
Well, Gillian, first of all, thank you very much. I'm incredibly excited to be here talking to you on this really important topic of sustainability in the emerging markets. And I think to your question around the EU, I think we really need to congratulate the EU for developing its sustainable finance taxonomy. It is probably the most coherent, thought out piece of legislation and regulation that sort of brings together the whole perspective around driving sustainable finance in the financial sector. And I think it's a really important achievement that we've seen. And I think that's actually something that's very, very positive, because if you look at what's really holding back sustainable finance for growing even further, I think one is the sort of alphabet soup of different definitions, standards, taxonomies, and by sort of setting out a framework which I think others can use, I think the European Union has really done everyone a really good service. So I think this is going to become probably one of, if not the most important global standard. I think saying that, I do think this taxonomy does need further work, which is something that the Commission itself has sort of signified. And in particular, given the theme of this panel, the area that we feel it needs to be most considerate around is the emerging markets and the impact on the emerging markets. This is very much a piece of legislation done for Europe with a focus on the European situation. But Europe and the UK are obviously important financial centres, not just for that continent, but actually globally as well. So what this will do is, I think, drive a lot of the different capital flows and treatment of sustainability. So I think it's really important that we get that emerging markets perspective in there, because actually that's where the biggest risks from climate change are, and that's actually where the biggest opportunities are as well to finance a leapfrog to low carbon technology. So I think that emerging market focus needs to come through much stronger. I think the second area is around sort of the green definition, if you like, becoming a number of shades. So moving from green to also a bunch of different things like olive, to really think about this issue around transition. Because I think that we sort of all know where the destination is, but we also need to know how do we finance the transition in that process. So I think the other area that would be helpful would be sort of a definition around a brown taxonomy, which the Commission has signaled it will do, but also that transition from, if you like, brown into green as well. So that's another big area of work. But I have to say that the taxonomy as itself is a great starting point.
That's fascinating. I mean, I must say, I find it very interesting that I'm talking to you from New York, and obviously America has gone down a very different route in the sense that the SEC has not embraced any kind of green or ESG taxonomy, quite the reverse. I mean, people like Hester Peirce are quite opposed to it, one of the SEC commissioners who could end up being acting commissioner. And the Department of Labor has again gone in the opposite direction from Europe in terms of looking at ESG in fiduciary duty, which means that any global organization right now is facing a world where essentially the European Commission is becoming the standard setter by default. It's a bit like what's happened in the tech sector in recent years. I'm curious for you, Candido, how does it look to you right now to have the European Commission essentially laying down so many of the definitions and the frameworks for environmentally and sustainable development?
Oh, thank you for the question. Hi, Helen. Hi, Daniel. Great pleasure to be here talking to you about the perspective from an emerging market, I mean, from Brazil, and how we see, I mean, everything that's happening in the world, and especially related to climate change in this very different year that we are all living. On one hand, I should first want to say that, I mean, there's no doubt that the pandemic has risen tremendously the level of awareness in relation to climate change problems in the emerging markets, in the whole world, but in the emerging markets particularly, I think. This is not only because we are having a especially dry year in Brazil this year, and as a consequence of that, but not only of that, we have fires growing and carbon emissions and so on. So this has also risen the level of awareness. As to the EU, I mean, settling the standards and the various possible standards and the rules about green emissions and so on, they have not reached us so far. But I think it's a very, very important initiative. I think, I mean, we definitely need standardization of data, of measures, of what's green, what's brown. And it will be very important when banks are required to be transparent as to the amount of carbon in its portfolio, in its general portfolio. But it should be measured equally, because this will create stimulus, the right stimulus, or it will incentivize green loans and green initiatives in the banks, and as it will also, I mean, make it more difficult, I mean, to have loans which are, I mean, more tied to fossil fuels and so on. But I do not see yet a uniform regulation concerning this. I mean, we have many different letters, initiatives, I mean, GRI, SASB, TCFD, the big four are now working on a unified system of accounting system. We have the IFRS making an inquiry on this, I mean, hearing banks. So I think that this is an initiative which, I mean, has different origins, starting from very different poles in the world, and none of them is dominant. I think we should definitely, I mean, make a move towards having this standardized and one single measurement, one single regulation, which would make it easy to understand and easy to deal with.
Well, I should ask you, how do you say alphabet soup in Portuguese? Because I think that's a question we're all going to need to learn at some point. Because I must say, at the beginning of the last decade, I used to cover credit derivatives and all the innovations around securitization. And I used to joke back then that I could not imagine a sector of financial innovation with more acronyms. And unfortunately, I have now discovered one, which is sustainability. And of course, it shares many of the same defining characteristics of any new area of finance, in the sense of fragmentation, opacity, immature markets, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just curious, I'd like to ask both of you, I mean, does your bank, Candido, use, say, TCFD at the moment, or any of the other standards, SASB or anything like that?
Yes,
and then I'll ask you, Daniel.
Yes, I mean, we are following and we are advanced into adopting, I mean, SASB, TCFD. I mean, we adopted because, I mean, as trying to be good corporate citizens. But yeah. I don't see this working effectively yet, Helen. This is what I mean. I think, I mean, most of our initiatives, and we have many initiatives related to climate change, to ESG goals, and so on. They are done independently of how it will be accounted for. They are done because it's the right thing to do. But I would love to see this more standardized, as I mentioned, because this would also allow for the creation of carbon markets. And I think that carbon markets can be a fundamental tool in dealing with climate change in emerging markets. I mean, in the moment when you have economic stimulus for the landowner, when it becomes more rewarding for him to have the forest standing instead of cutting it down, I mean, this is the moment when you really, I mean, legislation comes to complete the task, but legislation is not what makes the task. I mean, you cannot have, I mean, it's very difficult to have a legislation that on itself creates all the desired consequences. I mean, you have to have economic stimulus, you have to have a general order that stimulates, that pushes people into the right direction.
So it's basically about trying to find market-based solutions to drive behavioral change rather than just relying on regulatory top-down orders.
Yes, I think let me just give you an example. I mean, the three largest banks, the three largest private sector banks in Brazil, which are Bradesco, Santander, and Itaú Unibanco, we have launched an Amazon plan 2 months ago. We have established a board, an advisory board of 7 specialists in the region, people from different backgrounds, but all of them very knowledgeable about the region. And we have created a plan with 10 different initiatives. And these initiatives, if we will, they are divided into 3 groups. The one thing which is dealing with sustainable crops in the region, like cocoa, cashew nuts, Brazil nuts, and acai, and things like this. Forbidding financing cattle raising in illegally deforested areas, and so on. So we have the bioeconomy. So a group of initiatives is tied to creating, I mean, destimulating the wrong initiatives in the region, like cattle growing in illegally deforested area, and stimulating the right cultures. I mean, those which can retain people in the land, which do not harm the forest, and so on. The second initiative is creating infrastructure in the region, infrastructure for the local population. And a very important thing, which is the third one, is regularization of land ownership. The problems of land ownership the difficulties in establishing who owns the land and so on, they are behind most of the destructive initiatives in relation to the forest. I mean, people cut down the woods, people burn the woods in order to plant in a land which doesn't belong to them. And you don't know who owns the land, who doesn't own the land. This is a very complicated thing in the Amazon specifically. So we are financing and participating in governmental decisions in order to establish a general rule for this. So this is a multi-year plan. We are investing a lot in it, and it has nothing to do with regulation. I hope and I think that eventually regulation will welcome initiatives like this. But you can't wait for regulation to start acting on the problem.
So it really is about creating market-based incentives. Daniel, does Standard Chartered have a view about the merits of a carbon price? Do you have one baked in internally in your own models? Because we had this extraordinary report coming out last week from the G30, chaired by Mark Carney and Janet Yellen, which was very explicit in calling for a carbon price, amongst other things, and pointing out that most of the financial sector had not yet fully necessarily appreciated the impact of that going forward, along with the rest of the non-financial sector.
Yeah, Gillian, look, as a former economist, I'm a big believer in effectively pricing your externalities. So carbon has a significant impact, as we all know, on climate change and the environment, and therefore, if you haven't priced it properly, it's not going to be able to, the market's not going to be making the right allocation decisions. You price it correctly, and the market will then start driving that. And I think we had an earlier panel today about the work that Bill, CEO at Standard Chartered, and that we're doing as part of the Task Force to Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. Because I think actually carbon and carbon markets and the carbon price are going to be a key part of how we get to net zero across a lot of the private sector companies. And I think, as Candido was saying, regulation has a really important role to play here. But equally, I don't think the private sector can or should indeed wait for regulation to catch up. So the task force that we've launched with the IIF and 50 other institutions across finance, buyers and sellers of carbon credits, market infrastructure and producers and manufacturers is all about effectively how do we get to the net in net zero. Companies, I think now of around $11 trillion worth of revenue have declared net zero targets. And I think actually there's an opportunity here for the private sector to really show how it can create a market effectively that will allow people to use carbon offsets as a way of mitigating some of that emissions impact. I think that the primary focus clearly has to be to reduce our environmental impact, but even as if you push that to the current extent of what technology currently allows, we're still going to be emitting some things, which is why I think this carbon market's become really, really important. And the reality is today the carbon market is around $300 million worth a year. It's highly fragmented. We don't have the level of standardization needed for a vibrant and transparent market. So this is what the task force is really looking to do. And I think we've brought together under the IIF a really great number of different, very important institutions that hopefully will set out a very important blueprint for exactly that.
Right, that's very interesting. I must say, I find it fascinating that in a country like America, maybe even in a country like America, there is a pretty bipartisan support for some form of carbon price, carbon tax, carbon dividend in parts of the Republican Party. Not all of it, but part of it. And I suspect that looking for a more market-based solution may be one way to actually push that forward, just a thought. But I'd like to come back to the question, I mean, the 2 points that you raised, Daniel, about the taxonomy and how this whole debate is developing. First of all, on the question of green and brown and what I like to call olive finance, initially there was a very strong perception that you could divide the world into two buckets, you know, green, virtuous assets and brown, dirty, sinful assets. And you're suggesting that actually the world is a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, and actually I may even complicate it further, because I think it's not just a question of green. I actually think we need to, if you like, move to many different shades of green, your olive you just mentioned, but I also think we need to turn green and turn it into a bit of a rainbow. Because if you really want to catalyze sustainable finance to where it really matters, then I think we should not just look at the issue around climate, but actually the broader sustainable development goals as well. And so I think, there is clearly a climate emergency, but equally, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set out by 2030, there's a gap of about $2.5 trillion a year that needs financing. So we need to find ways to catalyze capital into issues like gender, into the ocean, which generates 50% of the world's oxygen, captures 25% of its carbon, and gets currently a fraction of the amount of capital that goes into sort of green aspects. And a number of other areas within the SDGs. I think this is a key component of it. And I think that the sort of, if you like, the tension and trade-off here is how do we create the right set of standards that allows the market and particularly investors to have confidence to really put capital to work, but also allow that innovation to come through so that we're going to start directing capital to where it really matters the most.
Right, right. I mean, in terms of practicalities, a lot of financial institutions right now are starting to launch what are called transition instruments, which try to recognize that we are dealing with shades of green or olive, as I sometimes call it, and create almost an olive yield curve or a yield curve in virtue that as people gradually begin to get greener, their cost of funding begins to fall. Do you think that kind of transition focus, the idea this is a journey, not just a clear-cut taxonomy, needs to be incorporated in how we see this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think transition is going to play, a really important part of driving finance to ensure that we become Paris aligned. I think that's really clear. And I think actually, particularly for emerging markets, that is particularly important, because if you look at the setup, say, in Bangladesh versus, let's say, Belgium, a lot more of the infrastructure needs to change. It's not as simple as adding just a whole bunch of solar or wind power. You've also got to think about how the grid is allocated, what the base loads are. And so we are going to see a much more gradual transition in emerging markets than we do in developed markets. And so making sure that we have the capital aligned to support that transition becomes really, really important. So I think that this whole space around transition finance, it requires more definition, which is one of the reasons why we suggested in our response to the European Commission that becomes the sort of next part of the phase of the taxonomy work that the EU is doing. But also ourselves, we are working with our clients to develop. We're going to be publishing a series of industry by industry transition pathways on exactly how we're going to support our clients over the next 5 to 10 years move down that emissions pathway, as you talk about it. And if you like, underpinning that is I think a key point that the finance sector as a whole needs to embrace, which is we are also accountable not just for the emissions that we generate. So Standard Chartered has committed to being net zero in operations, but also the emissions impact of our lending, which far outweighs the impact of our direct operations. And so we committed a couple of years ago to measure, manage, and reduce those Scope 3 emissions, so the emissions generated by our financing activities. And we've published several papers on the process to do that. And part of that, I think, is going to be driving our clients as well to shift to a much lower carbon business model, which will be good for them, I think, in the long run and good for our communities. Right. And I think particularly in emerging markets, there's some very acute trade-offs here. So, for example, there are about 1 billion people in our footprint across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that have no access to power, whether it's dirty or clean. And so we need to be making sure that as we phase people away from coal and other brown sources of power and brown industries, that we're also creating other opportunities in renewables and solar and sort of lower carbon business models that allows living standards to continue to rise at the same time that we address the climate emergency.
That's a very, very interesting point. I should say, by the way, if anyone's watching and wants to send in questions, I would love to pick them up and get the audience engaged, because I know the IIF has a very well-informed and often quite highly opinionated audience. So please don't hesitate to send in questions, and I'll pick them up in just a moment or two. But Candido, I'd like to ask you, do you think that excessively rigid criterion definitions in the developed world or approaches towards sustainability risk robbing emerging markets of the capital that they need to develop the infrastructure to become more sustainable?
Well, if it's done the wrong way, naturally, I mean, this is a risk, but I think it should be exactly the contrary. I mean, I think the greatest danger of carbon emission increases comes from emerging markets. And if it is true that you can divide the economic and the financial frontiers between countries, you cannot divide the planet in this frontier. So, I mean, it's the house of all of us. So, I mean, we should, on the contrary, I mean, stimulate the inflow of capital into emerging markets designed to curb down emissions in these markets, to accelerate transformation, to stimulate good practices, and so on. So I think the banks in developed countries should get a premium for investing in positive initiatives, climate initiatives, or ESG initiatives in general in emerging markets. I think that many of the barriers that exist, rating barriers and things like this, I mean, should be tamed or should be compensated somehow if the investment is a sustainable investment in emerging markets. I think this would be something much more intelligent to do. I mean, if I don't invest in my neighbor because he has a very poor rating, because he has, because he's polluting and so on, I mean, he's only going to pollute more. And this air is coming to my lands anywhere. I mean, I cannot place a barrier there. So I think it would be very, very short-sighted from authorities in general and from banking authorities to create very strict limits for this. Having said that, it is very important that we enforce good practices in emerging markets as well. And I think that regulation has done little in this direction so far. I mean, we are, at our bank in Brazil, we are at zero emissions for a couple of years already. I mean, we compensate our own emissions, but there is no, and we use environmental analysis for our credit analysis for 20 years already, and we are very strict on that. Just because this is good banking, this is good business. I mean, it's environmentally healthy companies tend to be financially healthy companies. I mean, interests there are perfectly aligned. But there is much more that could and should be done, and I insist here. I mean, I think taxonomy is fundamental, and it should be simple, even if not perfect. But it should be simple. If we try, I mean, if you have 20 different goals, you have no goal at all. I mean, so we should have simple, clear goals which could be measured and could be followed quickly. And one of them, I think, the easiest one is carbon emission. I mean, if we measure carbon emission correctly, I mean, there's so many different things that could be done. I come back to the Amazon because, I mean, it's such a dominating issue in the world in general, but in Brazil. Legislation in Brazil allows for 20%, an owner of a piece of land in the Amazon is allowed to cut down 20% of the area to plant or to do something. The problem is not cutting down what they are allowed to cut down. The problem is that much more is being cut down illegally. And I mean, here we really need government intervention. We need many things to be done. But once we go in this direction, it will be very easy to convince the landowners not to deforest. Because by any measure you take, I mean, if you pay for the carbon sequestration of the land he has, it will be much more than he can ever make by raising cattle or planting anything in this piece of land. But the market is not there, so you cannot offer this alternative. I heard, a podcast another day from Freakonomics, which compared, the amount of money made with this cattle raising in illegally deforested area in Brazil at $1 billion a year, and the value of carbon sequestration of the forest at $40 billion a year. So, it's really, it's just logic, and it should just be good business if we had good instruments and good measurements. So I think this is really an urgent question, the question of a clear set of rules. It won't be perfect. It cannot be very complex. It should, on the contrary, be simple, but I think it would do a lot in terms of aligning interests, and then, the interests of emerging markets and developed markets would also be aligned.
Of course, it begs the question on who on earth is going to create those rules. And I do know that the IIF has been trying to work to look at embedding things like carbon pricing and things like that. I'm curious, Daniel, do you think that it's time to simply say upfront, this is the absolute top priority, to start pricing carbon properly, and maybe to have a tiered system to price it differently in emerging markets and developed markets, as groups like the IMF have suggested?
Gina, if I may, I just want to pick up on something that Khadija was saying, because I think this is a really important point, which is that where matters almost as much, and may in fact matter more than how much. And I think one of the challenges that I sort of would set those of us involved in sustainable finance in the industry is to celebrate constantly the sort of league tables, the fact that we've seen another record high in issuances. I think this is really positive. But the reality is that dollar invested can have a radically different outcome depending on where and how it is deployed. We just published our impact report on our sustainable financing that aligns it to the SDGs. And that shows that financing the same size solar project in France versus one in India, the one in India will have 7 times the impact in terms of climate change, in terms of taking emissions out of the system. But the reality is, if you look at emerging markets, less than 1/3 had more than $100 million of clean energy investment going in per year for the last decade. And that's less than would be required to fund one solar project or one wind project. So how do we move capital from Leon to Luck now so that we can actually unlock this opportunity within emerging markets, which will drive the substantial change that I think we will see in terms of moving towards Paris and keeping global warming sub 2 degrees. So I do think emissions has, as you sort of asked in the question, a very important role to play, and I think it's helpful because effectively it allows a benchmarking, and so it's a very concrete thing that you can see in terms of the impact. But I also think we need to keep in mind, how do we actually catalyze the flow of capital into emerging markets so that we can see this shift into lower carbon business models in emerging markets, where I actually think they have the biggest opportunity to leapfrog. And so part of that, I think, absolutely is in terms of setting standards, but part of that also is coming up with whether it's new products from within the financial sector or looking at mixtures such as blended finance, where we can have the public sector and private sector coming together to really drive capital into some of the more frontier markets.
Right. I mean, blended finance really is one of the big missing pieces of this puzzle, because, there really hasn't been a lot of, blended finance on a scale that you would expect and need right now to actually address these big picture infrastructure questions. And it remains a bit of a mystery to me why, given that we have so much capital looking to find a home right now. I'd like to ask you both if you have a sense on why blended finance, in my view, has been such a disappointment so far. Do you have a view on that, Candido?
Sorry, Helen, I must confess to my ignorance in what is blended finance.
Blended finance is basically when you get public-private sector working together, and typically the public sector will take the risky portion and provide some kind of wrap for the infrastructure project. I know that, Daniel, Standard Chartered has been looking at this quite a bit, haven't you?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Julian. And I think, as you say, I think blended finance is, if you like, the strategic use of public capital, so whether it's from development finance institutions, multilaterals like World Bank, effectively catalyzing the private sector by whether it's taking a first loss or a differentiated transfer of capital to encourage the private sector to go in where it wouldn't before. Standard Chartered has done about $5 billion worth of these transactions in recent years across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, predominantly actually a lot in Africa. And you know, I would agree with you. I think blended finance has a lot of opportunity, but that opportunity has not been fully realized. I think particularly when we need the scale of financing that we need to see mobilized into emerging markets. I think there's some really good models. So, for example, the Scaling Solar initiative that the World Bank IFC have been running for in a number of countries to really scale solar. And I think there's some very specific, interesting product bonds that we do. Also was a form of blended finance. So there's some really good things, but I think we do need to scale that. And I think that requires, if you like, a little bit more standardization within the private sector so that investors can have comparable issuances. But it also requires, I hope, more multilaterals and development finance agencies putting capital behind blended finance to really scale it.
Right. Candido, do you have anything to add on that front, or?
Oh, I just think that I mean, here in Brazil, I mean, you have many bonds which have a tax deduction. So it's not exactly blended finance. I mean, there's no public capital directly involved, but the bearer of the bonds has a tax benefit, which is a way of doing it. And I mean, we've been leaders in the market. We also making $5 billion of those in the last couple of years in green financing. But what I see here, Helen, is that governments in general will be very much indebted after this pandemic. So I am not a great believer in solutions that depend largely on public capital for working. I think I think we must expect from regulators, from government, rules and clear rules, a clear set of rules, taxonomy, and so on. But I think that the private sector should do the job here. I mean, with its own resources. About climate change and the dangers it represents and how important it is to fight it. I have been saying here, I'm not very much it's not my role to judge the government, but I think that the lack of results speak for themselves. I mean, the results in terms of curbing down deforestation in Brazil have been extremely poor so far. So whatever it is we are doing, we must do better.
Right. And just, you know, we've almost out of time. Sadly, I think we've not connected up the tech to get the questions, but I should say, by the way, anyone who's watching this and is interested and wants to raise issues going forward at some point, do feel free in the future to email us at our Moral Money platform at the Financial Times, because we are covering a lot of these issues in a lot of detail week in, week out. But I'm just curious to come back to Daniel's point about China, because so many of the people I speak to in America who are resistant to climate change policies and or ESG frame it in terms of, why should America be doing anything given that China is the main polluter? And there's tremendous skepticism about whether anything is actually changing inside China or not, and in particular in relation to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think that, Daniel, there's any chance that we're going to see significant change in China that could actually overcome the skepticism externally? And what about the Belt and Road Initiative? Will that go green at any point? We haven't got a lot of time, but I'd love to hear from your views on that, both of you.
So I think, first of all, Belt and Road has to go green. I think if it doesn't go green, just given the sheer scale and size of the investments and our plan for it, that's going to have a significant, you know, I think we would have no chance of getting to Paris climate. So, and actually we're part of the green investment principles for Belt and Road for precisely that reason. This has to be come about. This has to become about how you enable more low carbon technology, renewables across the Belt and Road, because otherwise I think we are in trouble. So that, for me, I think is a really important trend to watch for, is the greening of the Belt and Road. I think on the other side, China more broadly, I mean, I think we shouldn't sort of lose sight of that China has been almost instrumental in bringing down the cost of renewables generally for the globe, in terms of just the capacity that it's added and the sheer amount of projects that it's doing. And so I think it has the ability actually to shift quite rapidly, as we've seen it, into new technologies, into new spaces. So actually, I do think this commitment around being net zero by 2060 is significant. I think it will change quite a lot, and I actually suspect that we'll see change happen faster than 2060 by some way.
What about you, Candido? Because of course, you know, China has been such an important influence on Brazil in the last few years.
China is our main commercial partner. Brazil, I mean, both sides, and so it's really a very important partner. Though I would think the influence still comes much more from the U.S. and from Europe than from China. And I would fully agree with Daniel's view. I mean, when Standard Chartered has a very good view, a very deep knowledge and old knowledge of that part of the world, and I fully agree with what he said. But I'm always a bit in awe with this reasoning of if my neighbor is not doing anything, why should I do something? I think we should always separate things. I mean, one thing, press your neighbor, do whatever you can to get your neighbor work. But if you don't do what you have to do just because of that, you risk seeing yourself in the role of that mother in the Justice of Solomon, who said that the baby should be cut in half. I mean, so you're going to die anyway.
Well, again, that's a very good way of putting it. I think the problem really is I've sat with people, you know, in the coal industry and in the pipeline industry who've said to me, well, yes, we can clean up, you know, our efforts to, you know, or we can stop using coal, we can get tough, but I'm sitting here and then watching all the coal go straight to China. And I think that's part of the problem right now. And it's increasingly going to be part of the issue as we look at the emerging markets, if they are going to be suffering severe economic dislocation as a result of COVID. Because the question of how to actually get growth in the emerging markets is going to be so critical. But I'm just curious, Daniel, we're almost out of time, but one word each, or 1 minute from each of you. Do you think in a year's time we'll be seeing more green and sustainable finance or less? Daniel?
Yes. More, sorry.
More.
Yeah, I think that's a very straightforward question. Yeah, I think this, as I said, this trend is completely accelerating. I think what we will also see, though, is a couple of things. One, I hope we will see a lot more focus on the emerging markets and a lot more issuance in terms of products and financing going to the emerging markets. These are the markets that need it most. And I think, secondly, this issue around green becoming a rainbow. I think this COVID has also raised people's awareness around social issues, around health, around sanitation, and I think we're going to see a much broader focus around sustainability, not just green. I think climate will still remain absolutely one of the key focuses, but I think it will also then get broadened around how we can drive that broader move towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030.
Right. How about you, Candido?
I am also sure we'll see more, much more.
Right.
Much more involvement. And I think that this is a growing movement, and I think it's really unstoppable, and it should be.
Right. Well, I must say, from the perspective of the Financial Times and Moral Money, and if there's anyone watching who's not yet logged into Moral Money, which is our newsletter looking at these issues on the Financial Times, please do. From our perspective, we have been stunned by the degree to which engagement and interest in the platform has been accelerating. As I said earlier, back in March when COVID-19 started hitting America and Europe, I actually thought I'd made a mistake in pushing Moral Money so hard at such a time when we were having this economic disruption, because I thought that actually ESG may end up being seen as a luxury, but it turns out it's accelerating from what we can see. And we are certainly trying to do our very best to cover all of the issues we've been discussing today in an intelligent, easy to understand way, because we think very strongly there needs to be greater debate. Daniel, I think we spoke earlier about the fact that part of building a sustainable finance world will be having a grown-up conversation about the issues, which requires better information and intelligent, responsible media coverage, and a recognition about the challenges and trade-offs around the issue of being olive, not just green or brown, but trying to move towards transition, because they're not always such easy decisions, and there are subtle questions that need to be exposed, and that's what we're trying to do. So I just want to thank you both very much indeed for your very thoughtful answers and comments, and to wish you both the very best of luck in turning these points into practical action as we go forward in the next year in these challenging COVID times. So thank you both, and please stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.